Well, thank you. It's always great to be at ALEC. I've been hanging around here long enough that I feel like I'm seeing old friends every time we come out here. And one of the things that I know that we all share is our lives revolve around an election cycle. Whether we want to admit it or not, about September of every year, we begin to think about, I just have to hang on till Election Day. If I can get to November 5th, I can sleep again. And most years that works out pretty well. The election comes. In my world, pollsters are still, we have to talk a little bit about what happened. Some of you may have to worry about new committee assignments or leadership elections, but for the most part, it's a little less stressful. This year is different. And the reason it's different is because of what happened on November 5th. In this city, on November 4th, they believed that the election of 2016, the election of Donald Trump, was a fluke. What they learned on November 5th was actually it was the election of Joe Biden that was the fluke. And in this city, they are really afraid of coming to grips with what it means that Donald Trump was elected twice. And on top of that, they're nervous because there's a Republican Senate and a Republican House. And by the way, 55% of all state legislators in America are Republicans. So lots of good things. And the bottom line for this organization is that more than at any other time in my life, we have the power to reshape America's future by empowering states. That's what this is about. Donald Trump is shaking things up. He's the bull in a china shop. His administration will try to give some power back to the states, but I would encourage all of you not to wait. I would encourage all of you to think of what can you do in your state to reassert a little bit of your authority, your sovereignty, to take a little bit of power back. And more than likely, the administration will be supportive, but take the initiative and get started. Now, I say this because it was a day people were celebrating on the conservative side of America. I think we have to be very realistic about just what happened and where we are today. The good news is that there is a Republican trifecta. Things have been shaken up. There will be a new approach. But there is not, at this point in time, a mandate or a realignment or a completed reshuffling of America. There is the opportunity to do that. The opportunity exists right now to bring about a lasting change. In fact, some of the early signs are pretty encouraging. Donald Trump, in his role as president-elect, has a 52% approval rating. He was never that high at any point in his first term in office. People are willing to give him the benefit of the doubt. His trade policy, most voters recognize that tariffs are bad for the economy. And yet a majority of voters support the president-elect's plan to threaten tariffs on China and on Canada and Mexico to get help in solving the border crisis. People, they understand what is going on, and 54% agree with his approach. That's good news. The fact that so many Hispanic voters voted for Republican Donald Trump, big game changer. In the black community, and this is maybe a revealing indicator of what's really going on, among black voters with a college degree, only 5% voted for Donald Trump. Among black voters without a college degree, 19% voted for the president-elect. Now that is the same breakdown we're seeing across the country as we're seeing this working class realignment begin to take shape and beginning to see what is there. The only thing that's needed to complete it is for this administration to succeed. And that's a tall order. Voters are looking for three things. They want the economy to work for all Americans. They want the border secured, and they want common sense on gender identity issues. If the Trump administration can make progress on those, what will probably happen is there will be a Republican era, a conservative era, where control of the House, the Senate, and the White House is generally expected to be with the GOP. Now that's great. That's all the good news, and that's the opportunity we have to work for. But there's also huge risks. And what I'm about to say, I do not mean to be discouraging or diminishing what happened on November 5th. But we have to be realistic. Donald Trump won the popular vote. That's great. He did not win a majority of the popular vote. His vote total was just under 50%, which means a majority of Americans voted for somebody else. This was the 6th election in a row and the 9th in the last 10 where control of at least one arm of government changed hands. If the next 2 years do not work out well, 2026 will be the 7th. And if that happens, and this is the downside scenario, the Democrats will control the Senate and the House for the last 2 years of President Trump's term. Change elections have become the norm because neither side has really delivered in a way that voters are happy with. We've had 10 elections in a row where nobody got more than 53% of the popular vote. The last time a president won an election with a double-digit majority was 1984. And as I look around the room, a lot of you weren't even around in 1984. But if you weren't, it was so significant that Ronald Reagan won 49 states. We need a landslide like that, and the only way you can get there is by working the next couple of years to achieve those goals. People are not looking for a specific policy solution. Yeah, they instinctively like the tax cuts. They instinctively like a lot of policy ideas. They just want things to work. We talk about different things. We talked earlier today, we heard about efforts to cut government spending. Well, by a 2-to-1 margin, voters say it is more important to secure the border than to cut spending. What they want is an economy that works and a secure border. That has to be the focus, and I would argue that the way to get there is going to be through a little bit of experimentation. Now, when we start thinking in these terms and we begin to think about what does success look like, it is really basic. People need hope. They need hope that the future is going to be a little bit better. They're already seeing a little bit of it. Since November 5th, we have seen a modest increase in economic optimism. There is a belief that somehow things will get better with this new team in power. And if that belief is realized, and by the way, very specifically in the way people feel about their own personal finances, there will be a lasting change. But again, that risk is very real. I want to put, the work that you must do. On the one hand, you want to be supportive. You want to work in concert to make sure things are getting better in your states. You want to be reaching out to grasp some more power from the states away from official Washington. All that's great. But I want to put the story in the context of where we are as a nation. Our firm has done work recently on a group we call the Elite 1%. The first surveys we did on this were done in cooperation with Steve Moore's group, the Committee to Unleash Prosperity. We did additional surveys with our new institute, the Neapolitan Institute. This Elite 1% are people who have a postgraduate degree. And by the way, just simple point, you hear a lot about the diploma divide. That's misleading. The real gap is between people with a postgraduate degree and the rest of America. People who have just a bachelor's degree have views that are closer to those without a college degree than they do to the postgrads. So our elite 1% are people with a postgraduate degree. They live in a densely populated urban area like Washington, D.C. or Manhattan, and they make a lot of money. Their views are wildly out of touch with the American people. Let me give you a couple of examples, just in case you don't believe me. There's a politically active segment of this elite 1%. These are people who talk politics every day. And in that world, and this is the world that sets the political and media narrative for our nation today, 69% of them believe the rest of us have too much freedom. A majority of them believe that parents have too much control over the education of their children. 3/4 of them want to ban private ownership of guns. And what makes it even worse is they believe most Americans agree with them on these issues. A majority of them think the federal government should have the power to censor social media posts. And by the way, half of them think you should not be allowed to vote unless you have a college degree. I could go on, but you get the picture. When I look at that, I think what we're seeing is a group that has rejected America's founding ideals. And that's the fight we're in today. We are in a fight for the soul of our country. America was founded on the ideals of freedom, equality, self-governance. The American people, and by the way, most Kamala Harris supporters, most Democrats, most Republicans still embrace those ideals. The group that opposes them are the elites. And to give you a sense of just how that plays out, why it is creating such a horrible moment in our political system, why our political system is so toxic today, I'm going to share one of my favorite stories about the greatest football game ever played. And if there's any New England Patriots fans in the audience, I want to apologize in advance. But about 15 years ago, Bill Belichick and Tom Brady and the Patriots came into the Super Bowl 18-0, and all they had to do was beat the New York Giants, who barely made the playoffs, and they would be the only 19-0 perfect season in the history of the sport. Full disclosure, I brought my kids up and told them there's only two teams in football. There's the New York Giants and the bad guys. So we clearly had a rooting interest in this. And despite the fact that the Giants rarely play football anymore, my kids are still Giants fans. But on that day, it looked like the Patriots were going to win, but it was closer than expected. 2.5 minutes to go, the Patriots were ahead. The Giants had a 4th down. Somehow they converted on 4th down. Then there was a miraculous helmet catch. And then, and I can still see it, Plaxico Burress was wide open in the end zone. I couldn't believe it. The Giants were ahead and were going to win the Super Bowl and end the perfect season. What hardly anybody talks about is that at the end of that game, Bill Belichick, actually didn't even wait. He left the field before the game ended. He did not come to midfield the way every coach does after every game and congratulate the winning coach. It's probably the only time in his career he didn't do that. I don't know Belichick, but my understanding, my guess, is he was so close to the impossible dream, so close to that perfection, that it just broke him. He couldn't deal with it. Now, in today's world, we have an elite 1% who are in a little bit of the same position as Bill Belichick. Back in 1887, future president and the worst president in American history, Woodrow Wilson, wrote an article about the administrative state, and he dreamed of a government where we would send people to special schools to train them to be civil servants, and then we would install them in government positions and insulate them from voters. He wanted them to be able to make decisions that were rational and made by experts, and didn't really matter what the voters thought. By the way, we did a survey of government managers recently, and we did ask them, suppose you thought a regulation was needed and you knew that voters overwhelmingly opposed it. What would you do? None of you will be surprised to know that most of them said we'd ignore the voters and impose the regulation. That was Woodrow Wilson's dream. Well, for 150 years, that regulatory state, that administrative state has been growing. Sometimes 2 steps forward, 1 step back, sometimes growth during the New Deal. In the last 50 years, it has taken off. There are 5 times as many government regulators today as there were in the mid-1970s. I believe that the people who are pushing this idea, this elite group who have those views that they don't really like America's founding ideals, I think they thought we had finally won. Finally, the American people are letting us rule without the messiness of having to listen to voters. And they probably thought we should be thanking them, because obviously they know better how we should live our lives than we do ourselves. And instead, voters elected Donald Trump. Instead, voters began to push back at every level. Rather than thanking these elites for their leadership, they rejected it. I spoke at Harvard during the Tea Party era, and one of the professors there, perfect embodiment of what's going on, said, what I don't understand is why don't the American people just let us lead? It's what we were trained to do. Now, think about the arrogance of that statement. How were you elected to play a leadership role? You were elected by people. You weren't appointed to Harvard's faculty. But that was the attitude that we've been up against. And I think what we need to be focused on is, how do you break through that? How do you break through it at the state level? How do you break through it at the federal level? How do you make sure that as much as possible, the decisions about the future of America are made close to home? Wherever possible, made by families or local communities. When you need some larger involvement, made by a state government rather than the federal government. All of this goes to the idea of empowering people, and the first step in that is to move power from the federal government back to the states. When I look at this, when I see this in this larger sense, these next 4 years are our chance to save America. It is a fight for the soul of the nation. It is a fight to determine whether or not those founding ideals of freedom and equality and self-governance can survive. Can our nation continue to lead the world and be the shining city on a hill that Ronald Reagan talked about? I think the answer is yes. I am very optimistic. And I'm optimistic not just because of what happened on November 5th. I'm optimistic because I look at more polling data about what the American people believe than just about anybody on the planet. And I know that the people continue to embrace those ideals. They are frustrated with leadership that doesn't. So our task together is to stand up and make sure we fight for those ideals, pass them on to another generation, make sure that our children and grandchildren have the opportunity to enjoy those blessings of liberty, make sure that the system works in a way that puts the people in charge. And if together we can do that, we'll have done our part to give our nation a new blessing of liberty, and to make sure that government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from this earth. Thank you very much.